by both of those at the same time regarding the inbound and outbound traffic shaping, and also into the security section, allowing for MAC address changes for VMs. So that would be task number 2. And then third, regarding this distributed port group, I'd like you to block all VMs that are connected via that distributed port group. All right, I'm curious, how did you do with the hands-on lab? Hopefully you did absolutely great. And this walkthrough is going to be fairly quick. I'm going to take the tasks that were assigned in the hands-on lab and just do a real quick walkthrough to confirm each and every step. So if you're ready, I'm ready. Let's do the walkthrough. So I'm going to start by launching the vSphere client. I've had this lab up and running for a few minutes. I think vCenter is fully initialized. And I'm going to press F11 to go full screen. All right, and I'll go ahead and supply the administrator login and the lab password, and we'll click on login. All righty, right off the gate, I'm going to go ahead and click on the Nevada Data Center, click on summary, and reset these alerts to green. All right, and our first task is to create a brand new port group on the distributed switch called DSVM. So we'll click on the networking icon here. We'll go down to DSVMs. And it says here the vSphere distributed switch configuration on some hosts differ from that on vCenter server. All right, so let me go ahead and rectify that real quick. And I don't see any hosts that need to be corrected there. I don't see what the problem is. Maybe it was just still initializing. So let's go back to networking and let's create the new distributed port group called DPG2. So on DSVMs, we'll right click on that. We'll hover over distributed port group and we'll create the new distributed port group. And we're going to call it DPG space 2. Click on next, and finish. And then we'll go modify the properties of DPG2 by right-clicking on it, clicking on Edit Settings from the drop-down, and let's start. So under Advanced, here we have the Override option. And that allows us to have individual port overrides regarding the configuration on ports for whatever items we specify here. So it asks us for port overrides to allow port blocking, which is already allowed. Traffic shaping, which I will click there to allow that, and the security policy. So I'll click there to allow that. Also, while we're here on this distributed port group, so that would be under teaming and failover. And then for load balancing, we'll use the dropdown and we'll say route based on physical NIC load, just like that. So that part looks good. And the last piece was to enable NetFlow. So that's on the monitoring section here. NetFlow enabled, and we'll click on OK. All right, that was our first task. And for task 2, they want us to modify the port group called DPGVMs and the one we just made, DPG2, with the following parameters. And they want us to do it at the same time. So to do that, we're going to right-click on the distributed switch and then hover over distributed port group and then click on Manage Distributed Port Groups. And if we want to modify traffic shaping, we'll click that checkbox. And the other one was allow MAC address changes for VMs, which is under the security section. So with those two selected, let's click on next and let's do it. So we'll put a check here to say we want to modify these two port groups. Click on next and then allow MAC address changes for VMs. That's right here. So we'll go ahead and click on accept and then we'll click on next. And the next section was regarding traffic shaping and they wanted to allow inbound and outbound traffic shaping. So we'll do that. We'll enable the inbound. We'll enable the outbound. And with those both enabled, we'll click on next. And then click on Finish. And then the third task was to block all VMs connected to DPG2 and to test it with at least one VM. So let's go to DPG2 and let's see what hosts are there. There's not going to be any, and let's see what VMs are there. There's no VMs there yet because we just created that port group. But let's go to DPG VMs and let's go ahead and migrate. Let's do tiny VM1. We'll migrate him off of this port group and we'll send him over to the second port group. So we can right click on the port group where that current VM is. And from the drop down, we can specify migrate VMs to another network. We'll click on browse. We want to migrate them over to DPG2. We'll click OK. Click on next. Specify the VM we want to bring over. I'll bring over VM1. Click on next and then click on finish. And let's just fire up tiny VM1 just to verify it has connectivity before we block the traffic. So we'll click on power on to power up that VM and we'll launch the VMware remote console for access to the interface on that VM. All right, and let's do a ping out to www.vmware.com. That's going to verify DNS for us and also internet connectivity with ICMP. That's great. And actually, let me leave that ping running. And when we do a block on the port group, that should stop the traffic from continuing any further. So I'm going to hit Control-Alt to release the mouse, go back to networking, and click on the port group here that tiny VM is in. Right-click on that port group, and from the drop-down, we'll click on Edit Settings. From here, we'll click on Miscellaneous, and block all ports. We'll just say yes, and then OK. Then if we go back to our VM, you'll notice it's no longer pinging. There's no new pings that are happening. Now if we go back and take off the block, so we'll go back to our port group, right-click on it, click on Edit Settings, click on Miscellaneous again, and we will say block all ports. We'll say no, and we'll click on OK to confirm. And if we go back to our client, it is once again pinging. Great news. All right, so I'm going to do a Control-C to stop that ping, and I'm going to shut down that VM using the tools right here in the remote console. And that'll do a graceful shutdown. So thanks for joining me in this walkthrough regarding the virtual distributed switch and some of its features. Now, if you have the lab up and you want to, you also have the opportunity to practice some of the other things we covered in this set of videos, including the private VLAN approach. But if you do the private VLANs, I would make sure that two VMs are on the same ESXi host. And that way it doesn't have to go out to the physical network because the